England, 1842. The morning mist curled through London's narrow streets like ghostly fingers, muffling the sound of carriages beginning to rumble through the capital. On the fourth floor of a modest townhouse in Bloomsbury, Charlotte Ashworth awoke to the distant sound of street vendors hawking their wares. At 26, she had learned the art of invisibility. Her reflection in the stained mirror revealed a woman with delicate features, brown hair always tied back in a tight bun, and amber eyes that rarely met anyone else's. The daughter of a deceased reverend and a mother who had died in childbirth, Charlotte had grown up in the care of a distant aunt who saw her as little more than free labor. When she turned 18, her aunt sent her to work as a governess in the Worthington household, a prosperous merchant family who had risen through the textile trade. 8 years later, Charlotte remained there, raising children who came and went as they grew, always present but never truly noticed. Invisible. Miss Ashworth, Lady Margaret Worthington's shrill voice echoed through the hallway. Where did you leave the sheet music I requested yesterday? Henrietta's music teacher will be here in an hour. Charlotte hurried down the stairs, clutching her simple grey wool skirt. They're on the piano in the music room, madam. I've arranged them by composer, according to your preferences. Lady Worthington examined her critically, as she always did, looking for flaws where she rarely found them. Very well. Remember, we are hosting the Duke of Ashford for tea today. Keep out of sight of the children. We do not wish our distinguished guest to be disturbed by inappropriate presences. Certainly, my lady, Charlotte replied, keeping her eyes downcast as a familiar feeling of invisibility enveloped her like a heavy cloak. The Duke of Ashford. Alexander Thorne, the most feared man in the English aristocracy. His name had circulated through London salons for years, always whispered with a mixture of fascination and dread. They said his gaze could freeze the blood in one's veins, that he had ruined men with a single word, that he had destroyed reputations without remorse. Widowed at 33, he carried the weight of a scandal that society could not forget. His wife, Lady Victoria, had been found dead at the foot of the grand marble staircase on their country estate. The official verdict was an accident, but rumors whispered more sinister stories. From then on, the Duke had become a shadowy figure, feared by all who crossed his path. Charlotte spent the morning in the classroom with 12-year-old Henrietta and 7-year-old Thomas. She tried to focus on her French lessons, but her mind wandered to the visitor who would soon arrive. Why would the Duke of Ashford visit the Worthingtons? A man of his power and position rarely associated with merchant families, no matter how prosperous. Miss Charlotte, can you hear me? Henrietta's voice interrupted her thoughts. Forgive me, dear. You were saying. The girl sighed dramatically. I asked if it's true that the Duke of Ashford killed his wife and was never punished because he was too noble for common justice. Charlotte felt a shiver run down her spine. Henrietta. You shouldn't repeat such horrible rumors. They're just cruel stories invented by people with no better occupations. But Mom said that. What your mother discusses in her drawing rooms is not fit for young ears, Charlotte interrupted firmly, though she herself had heard the same rumors whispered in the kitchen by the servants. At noon, Charlotte led the children to the dining hall, where they would have lunch before retiring to the playroom while the adults received the dreaded visitor. She herself would eat in the kitchen, as she always did, sharing the table with the senior servants. I hear the Duke of Ashford has eyes that can see through lies, the young maid, Annie, commented as she served the soup. My cousin works for the Countess of Wilmington, who swears she's seen him make a man confess to gambling with just a look. Superstitious nonsense, retorted Mr. Hampton, the butler. Though I must admit, His Grace has a formidable reputation. They say he has no tolerance for falsehood or incompetence. Charlotte listened silently, as was her custom. Governesses occupied a peculiar position in aristocratic households, too educated to be considered simple servants, but not high enough to be treated as equals by their employers. They existed in a social limbo, invisible to both worlds. The afternoon passed slowly in the playroom. Charlotte read to the children as the rain began to patter against the windows, a typical London March afternoon. The sound of a carriage approaching made her heart race involuntarily. It had arrived. "I need to get a book from the library," Charlotte announced, standing up. It wasn't entirely a lie, though the real reason was the need to move, to dispel the strange anxiety that had gripped her. The Worthington Library was on the ground floor, a modest but welcoming room. Charlotte moved silently through the halls, practiced in the art of being neither seen nor heard. Her gift of invisibility, cultivated over years of survival. When he opened the library door, he froze. It wasn't empty. A tall man stood at the window, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light. Even with his back turned, his presence completely dominated the space, broad shoulders beneath a perfectly tailored black coat, hair as dark as midnight, and a posture that radiated absolute power and contained danger. Charlotte took a step back, intending to slip away discreetly before she was noticed. But then he spoke, without turning around. "No need to run." His voice was deep, velvety like aged whiskey, with a hypnotic quality that held her in place. "I'm tired of people running away from me." Slowly, he turned, and Charlotte felt the breath leave her lungs. The Duke of Ashford was magnetic in a way that transcended conventional beauty. Aristocratic features sculpted as if from marble, eyes so dark they seemed almost black, and an intensity in his gaze that truly seemed capable of seeing through all defenses to the bare soul. "I apologize, Your Grace," Charlotte murmured, bowing deeply while keeping her eyes downcast. "I didn't realize anyone was here. I will take my leave immediately." "Look at me." It wasn't a request, but a gentle command she found herself unable to disobey. Charlotte looked up, and the impact of meeting his gaze directly was like a physical shock. For a long moment, he just studied her silently, his expression impossible to read. "You're the housekeeper," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Your Grace. Miss Charlotte Ashworth." "Charlotte," he repeated, and her name sounded different on his lips, loaded with meaning she didn't understand. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth, how long have you been in this house?" The question caught her off guard. 8 years, Your Grace." 8 years, he echoed, approaching with measured strides, like a predator circling its prey. "And during those 8 years, you've become quite skilled at being invisible, haven't you?" Charlotte's heart raced. How did he know? How could he see what she had spent years perfecting? "I do not understand what Your Grace means." A smile touched his lips, but didn't reach his eyes. "Of course you understand. You move through the hallways like a shadow, speak only when asked, keep your eyes downcast, wear colors that blend into the walls. You've cultivated invisibility as a means of survival." Charlotte felt exposed, as if he had stripped away all her protective layers with just a few words. "Invisibility is a virtue for women in my position, Your Grace." "Really?" He was dangerously close now, close enough that she could feel the heat emanating from him, detect the scent of bergamot and something darker, more dangerous. "What if I told you that some of us can see through this invisibility? That some of us seek the very thing others ignore?" "Your Grace is being cryptic," Charlotte managed to say, though her voice shook slightly. "I'm being honest," he corrected, his eyes never leaving hers. "Something rare in this world of pretensions and falsehoods." He hesitated, then added in a lower, almost intimate voice, "I was looking for you, Charlotte Ashworth." The world seemed to stop. "Looking, for me? That's impossible. Your Grace doesn't know me." "I don't know him." A complex expression crossed his face. "Your father was the Reverend Thomas Ashworth of Yorkshire, wasn't he?" Shock left her speechless. "How does Your Grace know that?" "Because your father saved my life when I was 16, Alexander replied, his voice thick with restrained emotion. "I was riding recklessly, fell, and broke my leg. Your father found me, cared for me, and refused to treat me differently because I was a duke. He taught me that title does not define character." Tears stung Charlotte's eyes. "My father died when I was 10. I know. And when I learned he had a daughter who had been sent to work as a governess, I swore I would find her one day. To make sure the daughter of the man who saved me wasn't suffering. His eyes softened. It took me years to track her down, Charlotte. You're remarkably good at being invisible. Charlotte struggled to process his words. Your Grace sought me out of gratitude to my father. Initially, yes. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that set her every nerve ending tingling. But now that I've finally found you, I find my reasons have become much more complicated. Before she could respond, the door burst open and Lady Worthington entered, her face paling as she found the dreaded Duke so dangerously close to the housekeeper. Your Grace. Forgive me, I didn't know you had retired here. His eyes fixed on Charlotte with barely concealed fury. Miss Ashworth, what are you doing here? You should be with the children. Miss Ashworth was doing her duty, Alexander interrupted, his voice taking on an icy edge that made Lady Worthington take a step back. I stopped her with questions. The fault is entirely mine. I see, Lady Worthington said quickly, clearly intimidated. Miss Ashworth, please return to the children now. Your Grace, tea is served in the great hall. Charlotte curtsied and headed for the door, but as she passed Alexander, he murmured words so low only she could hear, This is far from over, Charlotte. I have found you, and I do not intend to lose you again. In the days that followed, Charlotte existed in a state of constant turmoil. The Duke's words echoed incessantly in her mind, I was looking for you. How was it possible that the most powerful and feared man in England had sought her out? And why had that brief encounter affected her so deeply? She tried to focus on her responsibilities, but found herself distracted during lessons, her mind wandering to dark blue eyes and a voice that promised, what exactly? Danger? Salvation? Maybe both. Miss Charlotte, you're very distant today, Henrietta commented during a particularly disastrous arithmetic lesson. Are you thinking about the Duke? Charlotte felt a blush flood her cheeks. Don't be silly, Henrietta. Why would I think of him? Because everyone's talking about how he looked at you in the library, the girl replied with the brutal honesty of youth. The servants say they've never seen the Duke look at anyone like that. As if you were the only person in the room. Servants should occupy their time with more productive tasks than gossip, Charlotte retorted, but her heart was racing uncomfortably. A week after their meeting, Charlotte was summoned to Lady Worthington's office. The woman's expression was a mixture of confusion, envy, and something that resembled fear. Miss Ashworth, we have received an extraordinary communication from the Duke of Ashford. She pushed a sealed letter across the table. Apparently, His Grace wishes to offer you a position. Charlotte's hands trembled as she picked up the letter. The handwriting was strong, decisive, each letter perfectly formed. Miss Ashworth. My 11-year-old niece, Lady Eleanor, has come under my care following my brother's recent death. She requires a governess with superior education and exceptional character. After our conversation, I consider her perfectly suited for this position. The salary will be £100 a year, with full accommodations at Ravenswood Hall, my estate in Devonshire. I expect your reply within 3 days. Sincerely, Ashford. £100. It was more than triple what she currently earned. But the money wasn't what made her heart race. It was the prospect of seeing him again, of finding out what he truly wanted from her. It is an extraordinarily generous offer, Lady Worthington said, though the words sounded forced. Though I must warn you, Miss Ashworth, about His Grace's reputation. A man who possibly murdered his own wife. They're just rumors, Charlotte heard herself defend, surprising herself. Never proven. Smoke usually indicates fire. Lady Worthington's eyes narrowed. If you accept, you'll be entering a potentially dangerous situation. Ravenswood Hall is isolated, far from any civilized aid. You'd be completely at his mercy. The words should have scared her. They should have made her refuse immediately. But instead, Charlotte felt a strange, wild emotion rise in her chest. Excitement. Anticipation. Something dangerously close to desire. "I accept the position," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. Ravenswood Hall proved to be as dramatic as its name suggested. The estate rose atop a windswept Devonshire hill, a Gothic structure of dark stone that seemed to grow from the rocks themselves. Pointed turrets pierced the grey sky, and ravens circled the rooftops like dark omens. As the carriage wound its way up the winding drive, Charlotte felt a mixture of dread and fascination. This place felt like something out of a Gothic novel, the kind of estate where secrets clung to the shadows and the past never truly died. An austere butler, Mr. Blackwood, greeted her at the entrance. "Miss Ashworth, we have been expecting your arrival. His Grace is riding, but Miss Reynolds, our housekeeper, will show you to your rooms." Miss Reynolds was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes that contrasted with the severity of Ravenswood. "Welcome, my dear. I must warn you that this is not a cheerful house. Many tragedies have occurred here. But perhaps your presence will bring some light." Her room was in the east wing, a surprisingly pleasant space overlooking the walled gardens and the marshes beyond. As she unpacked, Charlotte couldn't help but wonder where in this labyrinthine house Alexander Thorne spent his lonely nights. Lady Eleanor turned out to be a serious and reserved child, with light brown hair and grey eyes that watched Charlotte with intelligent caution. Orphaned for only 3 months, she bore her grief with a dignity that broke the heart. "My uncle says you're different from other governesses," Eleanor commented during their first meeting. "He says you understand what it means to be invisible." The insight of the observation surprised Charlotte. "Your uncle said that?" "He talks about you often," the girl admitted. "Ever since he heard you agreed to come. He seems different when he talks about you. Less somber." Before Charlotte could respond, a deep voice echoed from the doorway. "Eleanor, you shouldn't reveal all my secrets on your first day." Charlotte turned, her heart pounding. Alexander Thorne was leaning against the doorframe, still in his riding gear, his hair tousled by the wind. He seemed more approachable this way, more human, though no less dangerous. "Your Grace," Charlotte curtsied, very aware of how disheveled she looked after the journey. "Charlotte." Her name sounded different on his lips again. He dismissed his niece with a gentle gesture. "Eleanor, give us a moment, please." When they were alone, the air in the room seemed to charge with electricity. Alexander approached slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You came," he said softly. "Your Grace has offered me a position. It would be unwise to refuse." Was it just the position that brought her? He was dangerously close now. Or was there another reason? Charlotte forced herself to meet his gaze. "Why did you really bring me here, Your Grace? And please don't tell me it's just out of gratitude to my father." Something flashed in his eyes, a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "Very well. The truth, then." He took a deep breath. "I spent 3 years buried in guilt and isolation after Victoria's death. I convinced myself I was destined for loneliness, that anyone who came close would be destroyed by my curse. But then I saw you," he continued, his voice growing more intense. "Trying so desperately to be invisible, carrying your own pain with quiet dignity. And for the first time in years, I felt something other than numbness. Curiosity. Interest. Connection. Your Grace." "Alexander," he interrupted. "When we're alone, please call me Alexander." "Alexander," she tested the name, and saw his eyes darken at the sound. "This is dangerous. Society already suspects your motives for bringing me here." "Let them be suspicious," he replied, his hand reaching out as if to touch her face, but stopping inches away. "I spent too much time caring about what society thinks. Now I've discovered something more important. Someone more important." "You barely know me," Charlotte whispered, though every fiber of her being yearned to close that small distance between them. "Don't I?" His eyes raked her like a caress. I know you are strong where others are weak. I know you've retained your humanity despite years of inhumane treatment. I know there's fire behind that facade of invisibility. His voice dropped to a harsh whisper. And I want to watch you burn, Charlotte. I want to see you shine so brightly that no one can ever ignore you again. Before she could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Alexander stepped back sharply, his mask of formality slipping back into place. But his eyes still held promises that made Charlotte's blood boil. The following weeks established a dangerous pattern. During the day, Charlotte maintained her role as Eleanor's governess, teaching the girl with genuine dedication. But she constantly felt Alexander's eyes on her, following her movements around the house. He found excuses to be wherever she was, in the library when she was checking out books, in the gardens during her afternoon walks, in the music room when she practiced the piano after Eleanor went to sleep. Each encounter carried a growing tension, a magnetic pull that became harder to resist. People are beginning to notice, Charlotte warned him one evening when they met in the library under the pretense of discussing Eleanor's progress. The servants are whispering. Let them whisper, Alexander replied, approaching her where she stood by the bookshelves. I'm tired of living in the shadows of rumor and fear. But what about your reputation? What about mine? Your reputation will be safe, he promised. Because I intend to do everything properly. He took a deep breath. Charlotte, I know this seems hasty. I've only known you for a few weeks. But these have been the most exciting weeks I've experienced in years. His heart was racing. What are you saying? I'm saying I want to court you. Properly. Publicly, if you'll allow it. He finally touched her face, his fingers tracing her jaw reverently. I know about the rumors surrounding me. I know many believe I murdered Victoria. But you deserve to know the truth. Then tell me, Charlotte asked, covering his hand with hers. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, pain crossing his features. Victoria and I had an arranged marriage, devoid of love on either side. She fell in love with another man, my best friend, Edward Hartley. When I found out, I offered her freedom, a quiet divorce. That was extraordinarily generous, Charlotte observed. It was practical, he corrected. But Edward wasn't the man I thought he was. When Victoria told him she would leave with me to make the divorce possible, that she would lose her title and much of her fortune, he cruelly rejected her. His voice grew hoarse. That night, Victoria had drunk too much, was emotionally shattered. I heard her coming up the stairs and offered help, but she angrily refused. Minutes later, I heard her scream, the terrible sound of her falling. By the time I arrived, she was gone. Tears glistened in her eyes. The verdict was accidental, but people looked at me and saw a betrayed husband with motive for murder. Edward, coward that he was, never admitted his involvement, leaving me to bear all the guilt and shame. I believe you, Charlotte said without hesitation, and saw the relief transform her face. Why? He asked. Why do you believe when so many others didn't? Because I see who you really are, she replied. Not the feared Duke society has painted you, but the man who sought out a reverend's daughter out of gratitude. The man who loves his niece tenderly. The man who sees me when I spent years being invisible. Alexander pulled her into his arms, and Charlotte went willingly, feeling safe for the first time in her life. When his lips met hers, it was tentative at first, asking permission. But when she responded, deepening the kiss, all the pent-up passion between them exploded. I'm yours, he whispered against her lips. If you want me. With all my baggage, my demons, my ruined reputation. I'm yours, Charlotte. And I'm yours, she replied, feeling tears of joy roll down her face. Completely. But his newfound happiness would soon face its first true test. A week later, Edward Hartley arrived in Ravenswood, invited to a business meeting that Alexander couldn't refuse without arousing suspicion. Charlotte first saw him at dinner, a conventionally handsome man with blonde hair and charming blue eyes that seemed utterly empty when studied closely. He treated Alexander with false cordiality, seemingly unaware of the damage he had done. "So this is the new governess I heard about," Edward said, his eyes roving over Charlotte in a way that made her feel dirty. "Much more attractive than one would expect for such a position." "Miss Ashworth possesses exceptional qualifications," Alexander replied coolly, his hand gripping the fork hard enough to whiten his knuckles. For the next few days, Charlotte felt Edward watching her, his gaze filled with malicious speculation. He clearly suspected the nature of her relationship with Alexander and seemed determined to cause trouble. "You must be careful," Miss Reynolds warned Charlotte. "Mr. Hartley is a dangerous man. He ruined Victoria and now seems determined to destroy what remains of His Grace's happiness." The warning proved prophetic. On the third night of Edward's visit, Charlotte was summoned to the library by what she believed to be a message from Alexander. But when she arrived, she found Edward alone, a predatory smile on his lips. "Miss Ashworth, how punctual," he said, blocking the door behind her. "We need to discuss your delicate situation." "I have nothing to discuss with you," Charlotte replied, keeping her voice steady despite her growing fear. "Oh, but there is. You see, I know exactly what's going on between you and our dear Duke. A sordid little affair that could ruin you completely if it became public knowledge." "The Duke is courting me honorably," Charlotte declared. Edward laughed cruelly. "Is that what he says?" "Oh, my dear, you are so naive. Alexander Thorne is incapable of love. He is using you, just as he used Victoria. And when he tires of you, he will discard you like trash." "You're lying," Charlotte replied, though a pang of doubt pierced her. "Am I?" Edward stepped dangerously close. "Or am I simply trying to save you from Victoria's fate? Think, miss. A duke and a governess. Such a marriage would be scandalous. He will never truly marry you. You will be his mistress, ruined and discarded. Get away from her." Alexander's voice cut through the air like a whip, and Edward turned to find the Duke in the doorway, icy fury radiating from every line of his body. "Alexander, I was just warning you about your own lies and manipulations." Alexander advanced like a predator. "You destroyed Victoria with your false promises and cowardly rejection. I will not allow you to destroy Charlotte as well." Edward paled. "You have no proof of anything." "No." Alexander produced a letter from his coat. "This letter, written by Victoria days before her death, details your entire relationship, your promises, your brutal rejection when she needed you. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right moment." The color drained completely from Edward's face. "You wouldn't dare make it public. The scandal. It would completely destroy your reputation," Alexander finished, his voice dangerously soft. "Yes. And I wouldn't hesitate if you threatened Charlotte in any way. Now get out of my house. If you're still here by dawn, I'll send this letter to every newspaper in London." Edward fled like the coward he was, leaving Charlotte trembling with delayed reaction. Alexander was at her side in an instant, pulling her into his arms. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" "No," Charlotte whispered against his chest. "But he planted doubts. Alexander, is he right? Is our relationship impossible? Do you really intend to marry me, or am I just?" Alexander cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Charlotte Ashworth, listen to me very carefully. You are not a distraction, not a convenient lover, not a way to pass the time. You are the woman who brought me back to life. The woman I want by my side for the rest of my days." He knelt before her, and Charlotte's heart stopped. "I know it's quick. I know society will talk. But I also know, with absolute certainty, that I will never love another as I love you. Charlotte, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears were streaming freely down her face now. "But the scandal." "Let them talk," he said fiercely. Let them whisper and speculate. I've faced worse. And this time, I'll have you by my side. Together, we can weather any storm. Yes, Charlotte whispered, then louder, yes, Alexander. Yes. The kiss they shared sealed a promise they both intended to keep forever. The announcement of their engagement caused exactly the sensation they had hoped for. London newspapers were filled with speculation about the cursed Duke and his mysterious governess. Some applauded the unlikely romance, others condemned it as further proof of Alexander's scandalous nature. But Charlotte found she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She was being seen, loved, celebrated by the man she'd chosen to share her life with. Do you regret it? Alexander asked one night as they walked through the Ravenswood gardens. All the stares, the comments, the scrutiny. Charlotte squeezed his hand. I spent 26 years being invisible, Alexander. Thinking it was my only way to survive. But you taught me there's something better than survival. There's living. There's being seen. There's love. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. You saved me as much as I saved you, you know. When I found you in that library, trying so desperately to disappear, I saw a reflection of myself. Both of us hidden, both afraid of being truly seen. And now, she asked, tracing the lines of his face. Now we shine together, he replied. And let the whole world watch. The wedding took place 2 months later at Ravenswood Chapel, an intimate ceremony attended only by the closest of family. Eleanor was the maid of honor, beaming at the sight of her uncle finally happy. Miss Reynolds wept profusely, while even the austere Mr. Blackwood was seen discreetly wiping his eyes. Charlotte wore a simple yet elegant champagne-colored silk dress, her hair loose for the first time in years, cascading over her shoulders in chestnut waves. When Alexander saw her walking toward him, the naked adoration on his face made all the years of invisibility worthwhile. You're stunning, he whispered as she reached his side. I'm seen, she corrected softly. By you. And that makes me feel beautiful. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but charged with added meaning for two hearts that had found each other against all odds. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander's kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of all the nights to come. The reception was joyous, filled with music and laughter. Charlotte danced first with her husband, then with the many guests who had traveled to witness their unlikely union. Even some members of the more progressive aristocracy were in attendance, curious about the woman who had captured the heart of England's most feared duke. Lady Ashford, the Countess of Wilmington, addressed Charlotte during a quiet moment. I must congratulate you. You have achieved something many thought impossible, restoring humanity to our dear Duke. Charlotte smiled. He never lost you, my lady. He simply needed someone who would look beyond the rumors to see the real man. Wise beyond her years, the Countess observed approvingly. Society may have resisted her initially, but her grace and dignity will win over even the harshest critics. As the evening wore on and the guests gradually withdrew, Alexander took Charlotte by the hand and led her away from the festivities, up the grand staircase to his private quarters. Nervous? He asked softly, closing the door behind them. Charlotte turned to face him, her husband, and felt only anticipation. No. For the first time in my life, I know exactly where I belong. Here, with you. What followed was tender and passionate, a mutual discovery that left them both breathless and deeply connected. Alexander was gentle, attentive, ensuring her pleasure before his own. And Charlotte, finally free of the restrictions that had defined her for so long, allowed herself to feel everything, without fear, without shame. I love you, Alexander whispered into the darkness afterward, holding her against his chest. My Charlotte. My Duchess. My salvation. And I love you, she replied, tracing lazy patterns on his skin. My Alexander. My husband. My home. The following months brought adjustments, but also unexpected joys. Charlotte assumed her responsibilities as Duchess with natural grace, gradually winning the hearts of both tenants and staff. She implemented educational reforms for the estate's children, established a girls' school, and used her position to help other women in vulnerable situations. "You are transforming Ravenswood," Alexander observed one afternoon, watching her work on her plans. "Bringing light where there was only darkness." "We're transforming together," Charlotte corrected. "You gave me the power, but we used that power for good." Eleanor blossomed under their care, becoming less reserved, more confident. The girl clearly adored both Charlotte and her uncle, and often commented that she finally had a real family. Society, as the Countess had predicted, gradually accepted the new Duchess. Stories of her kindness and charitable work spread, and soon Charlotte Ashworth, the invisible governess, became Lady Charlotte Thorne, one of the most respected hostesses of the English aristocracy. But the most transformative moment came 6 months after the wedding, when Charlotte discovered she was expecting a child. Alexander reacted with such pure joy that it brought tears to her eyes. "A baby," he repeated in wonder, his hand resting reverently on her still flat abdomen. "Our child. Are you happy?" Charlotte asked, though the answer was obvious on her face. "Happy doesn't begin to describe it," he replied, kissing her deeply. "Terrified, yes. But also happier than I ever imagined possible." The pregnancy went smoothly, with Alexander proving to be incredibly protective. He insisted that Charlotte get more rest, eat properly, and avoid any strenuous activity. She found him simultaneously adorable and infuriating. "Alexander, I'm pregnant, not disabled," she protested when he forbade her to ride. "Women have been doing this for millennia." "Not my wife," he replied stubbornly. "Not risking you or our child." Eleanor was ecstatic at the prospect of a cousin. "I hope it's a girl," she confided to Charlotte. "So I can teach her everything you taught me." "What if it's a boy?" Charlotte teased. "Then I will teach him to respect intelligent women," Eleanor replied seriously, making them both laugh. The labor, when it finally arrived on a stormy December night, was long and difficult. Alexander remained by Charlotte's side throughout the process, oblivious to the scandal of a husband present during the birth. He held her hand, whispered encouragement, and promised that everything would be okay. And he did. When his son's first cry echoed through the room, Alexander wept openly, kissing Charlotte's forehead repeatedly as he murmured his gratitude and love. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the baby in Charlotte's arms. "Healthy and with strong lungs." Charlotte looked at her son's small face, his eyes already showing traces of his father's dark blue, and felt her heart expand in a way she never thought possible. "Thomas," she whispered, naming him after the father she had barely known but never forgotten. "Thomas Alexander Thorne." "Perfect," Alexander agreed, his voice choked with emotion as he gently touched his son's tiny cheek. "Absolutely perfect." The years unfolded like pages of a fairy tale Charlotte had never dared imagine for herself. Thomas grew strong and curious, followed 2 years later by his sister, Victoria Isabella, named after Alexander's first wife, a gesture of forgiveness and peace that deeply touched all who knew the story. Eleanor grew into a remarkable, educated, and compassionate young woman who would eventually make her own love match, inspired by the example of Charlotte and Alexander. Ravenswood transformed from a dark and haunted estate into a home filled with laughter and light. The hallways that once echoed only with lonely footsteps now resounded with children's voices, and the library, once a refuge, became a center of learning for the entire family. Charlotte established a foundation to help housekeepers and women in vulnerable positions, using her own experience to create opportunities for others. The work brought her deep satisfaction, a sense that her journey through invisibility had purpose. "You're thinking again," Alexander observed one night, meeting her in the library where their story had begun. 10 years of marriage had not diminished their attraction, only deepened it into something richer. "I was thinking about how life can change," Charlotte admitted, accepting his hug. 10 years ago, I was invisible, convinced it was my destiny. And then you walked into that library and whispered that you were looking for me. And you believed in me, Alexander said, kissing her hair. You trusted me when the whole world feared me. Because I saw beyond the fear to the real man, Charlotte replied. The man who was as invisible as I was, hidden behind rumor and reputation. We saved each other, he reflected. Two lost souls who met in the darkness and walked together into the light. From upstairs, they heard the sound of their children laughing, chasing each other before bedtime, likely driving Eleanor and the nannies crazy. It was the most beautiful sound Charlotte had ever heard. No regrets? Alexander asked, as he sometimes still did, as if afraid she would wake up one day and realize she'd made a mistake. Charlotte turned in his arms, holding his face in her hands. None. You saw me when I was invisible. You loved me when I couldn't love myself. You gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams. How could I regret the greatest gift I've ever received? The gift was mine, Alexander insisted. You brought color to my black and white world. You gave me a reason to smile again. You gave me family, home, purpose. So we gave each other exactly what we needed, Charlotte concluded. Recognition. Acceptance. Love. That night, as the moon cast silvery shadows across the Ravenswood Gardens, Charlotte reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from that small room in Bloomsbury to this very moment. From invisible governess to beloved duchess. From a woman she believed destined for obscurity to a woman who shone so brightly that she illuminated everyone around her. And it all began with 4 words whispered in a London library: I was looking for you. Words that changed everything. Words that transformed invisibility into visibility, loneliness into companionship, survival into a full life. Charlotte fell asleep in Alexander's arms, secure in the knowledge that she would never again be invisible. Not to him, not to her children, not to herself. She had emerged from the shadows to claim her place in the sun, and the light was more glorious than she had ever imagined. 20 years later, Charlotte sat in the same library, now a woman of 46, watching through the window as her own daughters played in the gardens. Victoria, at 18, was as beautiful as her namesake grandmother, but with his mother's inner strength. Thomas, at 20, was at university, studying law with plans to use his position to help the less privileged. Eleanor, now married with children of her own, visited often, ever grateful to the woman who had given her not only an education but also a motherly love. Her children called Charlotte Grandma, and she cherished every moment with them. You've got that nostalgic look on your face again, Alexander said, entering the library. At 53, he was still devastatingly handsome, his hair now flecked with silver, the lines around his eyes the marks of years of smiling instead of frowning. I was thinking about our journey, Charlotte admitted. How everything changed that afternoon when I walked in here and found you. The luckiest day of my life, Alexander declared, sitting down beside her. Although I must confess, it wasn't entirely an accident. I planned it. Charlotte turned to him, surprised. Planned? A mischievous smile touched his lips. I was at the Worthington specifically to meet you. I spent months tracking you, Charlotte. When I finally figured out where you were, I needed to see you for myself. Make sure you were okay. The library was where I asked the butler to direct you. You conspired to arrange our meeting? Charlotte didn't know whether to be outraged or touched. I conspired to meet you, he corrected. Falling in love with you was entirely spontaneous and inevitable. But yes, that first meeting was carefully orchestrated. Excuse me? Charlotte considered for a moment, then laughed. No. Because it meant you sought me out. Really, truly sought me out. Just like you said. Always, Alexander promised, kissing her softly. In every life, in every circumstance, I would seek you out. Because you are my soulmate, Charlotte. The other half that completes me. As the sun began to set over Ravenswood, casting everything in golden hues, Charlotte leaned against her husband, feeling deeply grateful. For their journey, for their struggles, even for the years of invisibility, because they had all led to this moment, this life, this love. She thought of the young governess she had been, trying so desperately to remain unnoticed, believing invisibility to be her only protection. And then she thought of the woman she had become, a duchess who used her visibility to help others, a deeply loved wife, a devoted mother, a woman who finally saw herself clearly. The transformation had been extraordinary, but the most important lesson she had learned early, it wasn't Alexander who had made her visible. He had simply helped her see what had always been there, her own worth, her own light, her own power. She had been invisible because she chose to be, as a survival mechanism. But when she found someone who truly saw her, someone who loved her not despite her scars but including them, she found the courage to allow herself to be seen. To shine unapologetically. "I love you," Charlotte whispered. "And I love you," Alexander replied. "My invisible wife who has become impossible to ignore." Charlotte smiled. Because it was no longer about being seen by others, although that was gratifying. It was about seeing herself, recognizing her own worth, owning her own story. From shadows to light. From invisible to unforgettable. From sought after to found. This was her story, and she wouldn't trade a single moment of it. The years continued their gentle course, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. Charlotte watched with pride as Thomas graduated from university with honors, his commencement speech on social justice bringing tears to her eyes. He had chosen not only the path of law but specifically to work for reforms that would protect vulnerable women and children. "It's for you, Mom," he'd told her the night before graduation. "For everything you taught me about using privilege to help the voiceless. You turned your own experience of invisibility into a beacon for others. I want to do the same." Victoria, for her part, surprised everyone by announcing that she had no interest in simply making a lucrative marriage and hosting parties. She wanted to study medicine, becoming one of England's first female doctors, an audacious dream for a young woman of her standing. "People will say it's improper," Victoria admitted to her parents one evening, her expression a mixture of determination and apprehension. "That a duchess in training shouldn't dirty her hands with medical work." "And what do you say to that?" Alexander asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "I say property never cured anyone," Victoria replied with fire in her eyes. "I say if my mother can transform herself from an invisible governess into one of the most influential women in England, I can certainly become a doctor." Charlotte felt her heart swell with pride. This was the true measure of her legacy, not titles or wealth, but children who understood the value of using their positions to make a real difference in the world. "Then you will have our full support," Charlotte declared firmly. "Your father and I didn't raise you to be social ornaments, but to be agents of change." The decision caused a predictable scandal in certain social circles. Lady Worthington, now widowed and diminished in circumstances, wrote a scathing letter criticizing Charlotte for allowing her daughter to forget her place. Charlotte responded with elegant brevity, noting that Victoria knew exactly her place, beside those who suffered, using her skills to heal. But along with the criticism came surprising support. Other progressive families began to question the limitations imposed on their own daughters. The Countess of Wilmington, now in her 70s, publicly stated that she wished she had had Charlotte's courage in her own youth. "You have started a quiet revolution," the Countess told Charlotte over tea. "Not with shouting or protesting, but simply by living authentically and raising your children to do the same. It is the most dangerous kind of revolution, the one that changes hearts and minds." Eleanor, visiting with her 3 children, laughed as she listened to the conversation. Aunt Charlotte was always a revolutionary, even when she thought she was invisible. "I remember how she taught me that education was power, that knowledge was freedom. Those lessons shaped my entire life. And now you're teaching your own children the same thing," Charlotte observed with satisfaction, watching the little ones absorbed in books in the library. "How could I do otherwise?" Eleanor replied. "You showed me that family isn't defined by blood alone, but by love and commitment. You loved me when I was a frightened orphan, gave me a mother when mine was gone." These words touched Charlotte deeply. She had thought, in her years of invisibility, that she had nothing to offer the world. But in truth, her ability to love, to see value in others, to lift up those around her, these were gifts greater than any title or fortune. One spring afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A young woman, modestly dressed but with a dignified bearing, appeared at the Ravenswood door asking to speak with the Duchess. When Charlotte received her, the woman curtsied deeply. "Your Grace, my name is Sarah Mitchell. I wouldn't expect you to remember me, but 10 years ago, your foundation helped me when I was desperate. I was a housekeeper, fired without references for refusing the advances of my employer's son." Charlotte studied the woman's face, and a vague memory surfaced. "I remember your case. You were only 19. 18, Your Grace," Sarah corrected gently. "Your foundation not only provided me with shelter and training, but also helped me sue my former employer. We won the case, setting a precedent for protecting other women. Because of you, I became a lawyer, specializing in defending working women." Sarah's eyes shone with tears of gratitude. "I came to thank you personally, but also to ask for your guidance. I'm setting up a legal practice focused exclusively on cases involving wronged women. Your son, Lord Thomas, has kindly offered to partner with me." Charlotte felt emotion tighten her throat. "Thomas didn't tell me. He wanted it to be a surprise," Sarah explained. "He said his mother always believed that real change comes from systematic action, not just individual charity. A legal practice focused on justice for women would be the realization of that vision." In that moment, Charlotte fully understood the scope of her influence. She had not only transformed her own life, but had created ripples that touched countless others. Every woman helped by her foundation, every mind changed by her example, every injustice righted through her efforts, was part of a legacy much larger than herself. "You don't need my guidance," Charlotte finally said. "You already have everything you need: courage, determination, and a commitment to justice. But you will have my support, financial and personal. And I am deeply proud that my son has chosen this path." When Sarah left, Charlotte remained in the living room, reflecting on the extraordinary web of connections and changes that had grown from her experiences. Alexander found her there, still lost in thought. "You have that look that means you're up to something," he observed with amusement. "I've known that look for 20 years. I was thinking," Charlotte began, "that perhaps it's time to tell our story fully. Not the intimate details, but the journey. From invisible governess to duchess, yes, but more importantly, from woman who was not clearly seen to woman who found her own voice and power." Alexander sat beside her, holding her hand. "Do you want to write your memoirs?" "Not exactly a memoir," Charlotte clarified. "More of a guide. For women who feel invisible, trapped, without options. I want them to know that invisibility doesn't have to be permanent. That even in the most limited circumstances, there are choices, there is power, there is the possibility of transformation." "It will be controversial," Alexander warned, though his tone suggested support. "Some people will not like a duchess writing so candidly about the realities faced by working women." "May they not like it," Charlotte replied with the confidence cultivated over decades. "I've been silent for a long time. Now I have a platform and a voice. It would be a waste not to use them." The book, when published a year later, caused a sensation. From the Shadows, A Journey Through Invisibility, became an unexpected bestseller, avidly read by women of all social classes. Charlotte had written with brutal honesty about her years as a governess, the daily humiliations, the emotional labor of remaining invisible, the constant fear of dismissal. But she also wrote about discovery, about the moment someone finally truly saw her. About learning to see herself through loving eyes. About the gradual process of reclaiming visibility, voice, and power. And crucially, about how to use that power once acquired. Reviews were mixed. Conservatives denounced her as radical and inappropriate. Progressives celebrated her as a visionary. But what mattered to Charlotte were the letters she received daily from ordinary women, women who saw themselves in her words, who found courage in her story. One letter in particular touched her deeply. It came from a 22-year-old governess who wrote, "Your Grace, all my life I have believed that invisibility was my only option for safety. Your book has shown me that visibility, though frightening, is where real life happens. I have decided to go back to school, to become a teacher in a proper school where I will be valued. Thank you for helping me see that I deserve to be seen." This, Charlotte said to Alexander, showing him the letter, "This is why I wrote. If just one woman finds the courage to change her life, it was worth every word." Alexander kissed her forehead tenderly. "Hundreds will find that courage, perhaps thousands. Because you gave them something precious, a map through invisibility to the light." Alexander's 70th birthday was celebrated with a grand celebration at Ravenswood. The estate was filled with family, friends, and the many lives Charlotte and Alexander had touched over the years. Thomas, now a respected lawyer and social reformer, toasted his parents with moving eloquence. "My mother taught me that invisibility is often imposed on the vulnerable as a form of control," he told the assembled congregation. "My father taught me that true power lies not in dominating others, but in lifting up those around you." Together, they demonstrated that love and justice are not just abstract ideals, but transformative forces that can change the world. Victoria, now working in a London hospital and gaining a reputation as an exceptionally compassionate doctor, added her own words, "My parents taught me that titles and social standing are tools, not identities. That our worth comes not from how others see us, but from how we use our gifts to serve." Eleanor, her own children now teenagers, rose to speak. "When I lost my parents, I thought my life was over. But Uncle Alexander and Aunt Charlotte showed me that family is as much about choice as it is destiny. They chose to love me, raise me, and give me every advantage as if I were their own. That unconditional love shaped everything I have become." Charlotte, hearing these tributes, felt tears flow freely. Not tears of sadness, but of deep gratitude. She had thought, in those dark years as an invisible governess, that her life had no purpose, that she existed merely to serve others without ever being truly recognized. How wrong she had been. Her purpose had been immense, just not in the way she had imagined. It wasn't to remain invisible, but to emerge from the shadows to show others that such emergence was possible. To transform her own pain into power that lifted countless others. "You're crying," Alexander whispered, gently wiping away her tears. "Happy tears, I hope." "The happiest," Charlotte confirmed. "I was thinking of that young governess at the Worthingtons, so convinced of her own insignificance. I wish I could go back and tell her everything would be all right. Better than all right. Extraordinary." "She found out eventually," Alexander replied. "When a certain duke whispered that he had been looking for her." Charlotte laughed through her tears. "Those words changed everything. I was looking for you. No one had ever looked for me before. No one had ever thought I was worth finding. I always knew," Alexander said firmly. "Ever since your father showed me kindness when I was an arrogant boy who thought title meant everything. He taught me that character matters more than birth. And when I discovered his daughter was living in diminished circumstances, I couldn't help but reach out. To honor her memory by ensuring you received the opportunities you deserved." "But you gave me so much more than opportunities," Charlotte objected. "You gave me love. Family. Purpose. A platform to make a difference." "No," Alexander corrected gently. "You already had all these things within you. I simply helped you see them. The love, the strength, the vision, all of it was always yours. You just needed someone to reflect it back to you." As the party continued around her, Charlotte looked out the window at the Ravenswood Gardens, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. How many times had she been in this exact position, staring out the window, longing for a different life? But now, she longed for nothing. She had lived fully, loved deeply, mattered significantly. Her journey from invisible to unforgettable hadn't just been about social advancement or advantageous marriage. It had been about self-discovery, about reclaiming self-worth, about transforming survival into flourishing. And the most beautiful thing? She hadn't done it alone. Alexander had been by her side, yes, but so had Eleanor, her children, and the countless women touched by her foundation and book. Invisibility had isolated her, but visibility had connected her to a vast community of souls who also sought to be seen, loved, and valued. Do you know what I appreciate most about our history? Charlotte asked Alexander as night fell softly over Ravenswood. Tell me, he encouraged, pulling her closer. Which started with you searching for me, but ended with me finding myself. You were the catalyst, the beacon in the darkness. But the journey, the transformation, the growth, all of it was mine. You gave me space to blossom, you didn't force me into a particular shape. Alexander smiled. You've always been magnificent, Charlotte. You just needed time and safe space to recognize that. And then, surrounded by family and friends, illuminated by the warm light of candles and love, Charlotte and Alexander Thorne toasted to a life well lived, a journey well traveled, a love well nurtured. From invisible to unforgettable. From sought after to found. From shadows to glorious light. This was his story. And it was absolutely perfect. But life, Charlotte learned, never truly ends as long as there's still breath in her lungs. There are always more chapters, more lessons, more opportunities for growth and impact. And the universe seemed determined to remind her of this. 3 months after Alexander's birthday celebration, Charlotte received a letter that awakened long-dormant memories. The letter came from Lady Margaret Worthington, the woman who had employed her as a governess decades earlier, the same woman who had patronized her and kept her firmly in her place. Dear Duchess of Ashford, the letter began, its formality a stark contrast to the cold Miss Ashworth of the past. I write to you under circumstances I never imagined. My son, Thomas Worthington, has committed financial indiscretions that have resulted in the loss of our family fortune. I find myself, at 78, in a precarious position, dependent on the charity of distant relatives who receive me with barely concealed reluctance. Charlotte read the letter with conflicting emotions. Part of her, the young governess who had suffered under Lady Worthington's coldness, felt a grim satisfaction at this twist of fate. But the woman she had become, the Duchess who had built a legacy of compassion, felt only sadness at the fragility of the human condition. I do not write to ask for financial charity, the letter continued, though my pride has long been shattered to refuse if offered. I write because I read your book, From the Shadows, and for the first time I understand the harm I have caused. Not only to you, but to countless other women who worked in my home, whom I treated as invisible because I was taught so by society. I write to ask for forgiveness, knowing I don't deserve it. And to say that your transformation from invisible housekeeper to powerful advocate for vulnerable women is the most significant legacy any person of our generation could leave. You took your pain and turned it into purpose. I squandered my privileged position on trivialities and cruelties. For that, I am deeply ashamed. Charlotte finished reading with tears in her eyes. Alexander, who had been watching her read, asked gently, "Bad news?" "No," Charlotte replied slowly. "Unexpected news. Lady Worthington, my former employer, is in difficult circumstances and has written to ask for forgiveness." "And will you forgive?" Alexander knew his wife well enough to know that the question was not a simple one. Charlotte considered carefully. Forgiveness is not approval of what was done. It is release from the burden of resentment. "Yes, I forgive you. More than that, I will help you." "You're extraordinary," Alexander said admiringly. "Even after everything she did to you." "Precisely because of everything she did to me," Charlotte corrected. "Because her treatment taught me how not to treat others. Because surviving those years gave me strength that I use now to help. Because holding a grudge would allow her to continue shaping my life, even after all this time." Charlotte wrote a reply inviting Lady Worthington to Ravenswood, offering her a cottage on the estate and a modest income for her remaining years. The reply she received weeks later was written with a shaky hand but heartfelt gratitude. When Lady Worthington arrived at Ravenswood, Charlotte barely recognized her. The imposing, judgmental woman of her memories had been replaced by a frail, elderly woman, bent over by the weight of years and regret. But in her eyes, Charlotte saw something she had never noticed before: vulnerable humanity. "Your Grace," Lady Worthington tried to curtsy, but her legs were shaking dangerously. "Please, there's no need for formalities," Charlotte said gently, helping the older woman sit down. "Here, you're simply a guest who deserves rest and dignity." Tears streamed down Lady Worthington's wrinkled face. "I don't deserve your kindness. I treated you so cruelly. I saw you every day and chose not to truly see you. You were invisible to me because I made you that way. And now you see me," Charlotte observed softly. "That, in itself, is a significant transformation." Over the next few months, Lady Worthington became a regular presence at Ravenswood. She frequented Charlotte's tea parties, listening to stories about the Foundation's work, the social reforms Thomas championed, and Victoria's groundbreaking medical work. And gradually, something remarkable happened: her former employer became a supporter. "I wasted my life," she confessed to Charlotte during a walk through the gardens. "I had position, resources, influence. I could have used all of it to make a difference. Instead, I used it to keep people in their place, to preserve a hierarchy that caused suffering." "But you're making a difference now," Charlotte pointed out. Lady Worthington had begun writing letters to her former society friends, encouraging them to support Charlotte's foundation, to question how they treated their own maids and servants. Some dismissed her words, but others listened. "It's so little," Lady Worthington sighed, "compared to the years of damage." "It's everything," Charlotte countered firmly. "Because every changed mind, every opened heart, creates ripples. Your friends influence their daughters, who influence their daughters. True change is rarely instantaneous. It's cumulative." Lady Worthington's presence in Ravenswood also brought an unexpected lesson to Charlotte's grandchildren. Eleanor's children, now young teenagers, were fascinated by the story of the elderly lady's transformation. Grandma Charlotte, the eldest, William, asked during a family dinner, "How could you forgive someone who was so cruel to you?" Everyone at the table fell silent, waiting for an answer. Charlotte looked around at the faces she loved: Alexander, still her anchor after so many years, Thomas and Victoria, her children who filled her with pride, Eleanor deeply. "But holding a grudge is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. It only hurts myself." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "More importantly, people are capable of change. Lady Worthington is not the same woman who was my employer. She grew, learned, and chose differently. To deny her ability to change would be to deny the very change I advocate in my work." Victoria, always the most direct, asked, "But what if she hadn't changed? What if she was still cruel?" "Then I would still forgive her," Charlotte replied, "but I would set boundaries. Forgiveness doesn't mean allowing someone to continue causing harm. It means releasing the emotional weight of carrying anger. I can forgive someone and still choose not to have that person in my life." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I try to explain to my clients. Justice isn't revenge. It's restoration. Seeking to balance the scales without creating new imbalances." The conversation continued into the evening, each generation offering their perspectives. And Charlotte realized this was another form of legacy, not just the work she had done, but the conversations she had started, the values she had modeled, the way her family thought about forgiveness, justice, and compassion. Weeks later, Charlotte received word that one of Lady Worthington's old friends, Lady Beatrice Cromwell, wished to meet her. Lady Cromwell was known as one of the most strict and traditional matrons in society, a staunch defender of the old order. "Don't expect miracles," Lady Worthington warned. "Beatrice is difficult. But when Lady Cromwell arrived, her stance was less confrontational than Charlotte had expected. "Duchess," she began formally, "Margaret has spoken to me extensively about your work. Initially, I dismissed it all as dangerous progressive sentimentality." "What now?" Charlotte asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Now my 17-year-old granddaughter has announced that she doesn't simply want to make an advantageous marriage. She wants to study, have a profession, do something meaningful with her life." Lady Cromwell looked momentarily lost. "My first instinct was to forbid such nonsense. But then Margaret showed me her daughter, Lady Victoria, working as a doctor, respected and happy." The older woman's eyes met Charlotte's. "Tell me honestly, Duchess. By encouraging your daughters to defy convention, have you condemned them to difficult lives? Or have you given them something more valuable than easy social acceptance?" Charlotte considered the question carefully. "I gave them a choice," she finally replied. "Victoria could have chosen a traditional path. No one forced her to study medicine. But when she expressed interest, my husband and I made sure she had the opportunity to pursue that passion." "And is she happy?" "Ask her yourself," Charlotte suggested, and sent for Victoria, who was visiting for a few days. When Victoria entered, still wearing her practical work attire, Lady Cromwell studied her with barely concealed fascination. "Lady Victoria, your mother says you are happy in your unconventional choice. Is that true?" Victoria smiled. "Completely and profoundly happy, Lady Cromwell. I wake every day knowing that my work matters, that I'm using my talents to help people. Yes, I face prejudice and criticism. But I also have purpose and fulfillment that no arranged marriage could give me." "And marriage?" Lady Cromwell pressed. "Surely your profession limits your matrimonial prospects." "It limits prospects with men who wouldn't value me as an equal," Victoria corrected. "Which is exactly the kind of man I don't want anyway. When and if I marry, it will be someone who celebrates my ambition, not tolerates it." Lady Cromwell was silent for a long moment. Finally, she said, "You have given me much to consider. Perhaps there is merit in allowing young women to choose their own paths, even when those paths diverge from tradition." After she left, Lady Worthington hugged Charlotte. "You've just changed the mind of one of the most unyielding women in society. Beatrice has 7 granddaughters. Imagine the impact if she allows them all to choose their own futures." "That's the real work," Charlotte reflected. "Not grand dramatic gestures, but individual conversations, minds changing one at a time, values evolving across generations." Alexander found her later that night in the library, their shared sanctuary where it had all begun. "I heard about your conversation with Lady Cromwell. You're unstoppable, you know that." Charlotte laughed. "It's not me who's unstoppable. It's the idea. Once people start questioning arbitrary hierarchies, once they see possibilities beyond what they've been taught, change becomes inevitable." "And all because a young governess refused to remain invisible," Alexander observed, pulling her into his arms. "No," Charlotte corrected gently. "Because a duke chose to see her when everyone else didn't. Because he whispered that he'd been looking for her, making her realize she was worth finding." They stood like that for a long moment, 2 hearts finding each other through the darkness and walking together into the light. Around them, Ravenswood breathed with the life they had created. Children who changed the world, homes that offered refuge, conversations that transformed minds, love that constantly expanded to encompass more souls. "Do you know what I wish for now?" Charlotte asked softly. "Tell me." "I wish every woman who feels invisible knows that visibility is possible. May every person trapped by circumstances understand that change, though difficult, is achievable. May every wounded heart believe that healing and love await on the other side of courage." Alexander kissed her forehead. "Your book has already reached thousands. Your foundation has helped countless women. Your children will continue your work. Your example has already done all this and more." "Then my work is complete," Charlotte said with deep satisfaction. "No," Alexander disagreed softly. Your work will never be complete because your legacy ripples through every life you touched. Every woman you helped will help others. Every mind you changed will change others. You started ripples that will continue long after we're gone. Charlotte looked out the library window at the moonlit gardens, the same gardens she had once gazed upon, feeling trapped and invisible. Now she saw endless possibilities, not just for herself but for all the women who would come after. From shadows to light. From invisible to unforgettable. From sought after to found. This was his story, and his legacy, and his gift to the world. And it was, in every way, absolutely perfect. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe, like, comment, and share our channel. Your support helps us continue creating more stories of love, redemption, and breathtaking twists. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another of our historical stories. Click and be amazed by more beautiful tales like this one. With all our gratitude, Echoes of Romance.